We're going to discuss African Religions and Philosophy by John Mbiti. Really shake up your spiritual journey and look for thoughts and ideas beyond your own worldview. How can you walk a brighter path on this spiritual journey that you're on? Maybe you think you see in color, but there's a brighter and more beautiful reality out there. I encourage you to reach out beyond your comfort zone. Expand your understanding of the universe. This also expands the understanding of your inner self at the same time. Never stop learning, never stop growing, even if you think you have it figured out. Mbiti first published this in 1969, but he and his publisher released an updated second edition in 1989. This book is well written, well annotated, and it's expertly referenced. Spirituality is this massive tie that binds us all together. In studying diverse traditions, we see these commonalities between all of humankind and our common connection with nature and the world around us. It's important to read material about places that are actually written by people from those places. It's sometimes harder to find this kind of source material than it should be. In my time researching works of Latin American philosophers, African philosophers, and texts written by indigenous peoples around the world has very directly shown me how past biases still impact our current society. Some quite famous Latin American philosophers and other philosophers from around the world could barely be found in English, if at all. And if they were available, they were ridiculously priced. But regardless, I just urge you to search for authentic writing on subjects that interest you. I can definitely recommend this book as a foundational start to understanding African religion and philosophy. The world has finally done a better job over the last 20 years of understanding that Africa isn't a monolith. It's this massively diverse collection of rich cultures and traditions. Mbiti concedes the difficulty in approaching anything as fully or wholly African, but I'd say he did a good job at trying, and he keeps things interesting without diving too far into the details, which would really be impossible given the breadth of the subject at hand. This is probably a little closer to a textbook than some reads, but it still flows pretty well. He wrote it for university level students and academics, but it's still something that's approachable. It discusses indigenous African religious and spiritual practices. It delves into what God is and isn't, and into the spirits, mysticism, good and evil, and other spiritual subjects across the continent. It annotates what certain African peoples believe in these various geographic areas and across cultures. Mbiti gives a sense of unifying themes throughout Africa. He provides solid background and history from which to form a foundation to better judge everything he's writing about. He's a very learned academic. And so what is the divine here? I was most interested in how the various African cultures saw the divine and how they see beyond death and the spiritual connection with the divine or the universe or whatever they call it. This book does delve into all of this. African religions typically see God in a positive light and consider God to be merciful and showing kindness, taking pity over mankind. They believe God is essentially good, and there is a great section where Mbiti describes how different cultures across Africa name or describe God, and I think it was really beautifully written. But their divine's complicated. On the one hand, spirituality here seems to be seen in a more concrete, maybe even a wooden manner. On this, Mbiti says, there's little, if any, concern with distinctly spiritual welfare of men apart from his physical life. No line is drawn between the spiritual and the physical. There's neither paradise to be hoped for nor hell to be feared. The soul of man does not long for spiritual redemption or for closer contact with God in the next world. And so I think here we see a bit of a literalist perspective, but I don't think that's fully accurate, and I'm not sure that that's what Mbiti is completely getting at, because he also says on the more esoteric side, and I'll quote him here, there seems to be a force, power, or energy permeating the whole universe. God is the source and ultimate controller of this force, but the spirits have access to some of it. And so looking at that, as when looking at spirituality across the world, there isn't an absolute answer. We have to see the subtlety and nuance to it. And Mbiti continues, a few human beings have the knowledge and ability to tap, manipulate, and use it. And by it, he means the universal power. And he goes on to say, such as the medicine man, witches, priests, and rainmakers, some for the good and others for the area of their communities. So I see a universal thread here, and as an omnist universalist, I recognize the validity of most spiritual and religious traditions. You have these traditions that honor living in the world we all share, being present, appreciating all that we experience and have. But there are apparently some who have the ability to feel and see beyond, as Mbiti says, to experience the universe, that connection to the magic. And that strikes me as both particularly human and ultimately similar to most belief systems around the world. You have these people that are just going about their business and living their lives. And then you have these others that see more. They see beyond. And so that leads me to the question, what do you see? Mbiti doesn't simply stop with the traditional indigenous African faiths. He also does briefly summarize the impact of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism across the continent. These Abrahamic faiths and a few other religions have been around and seen in Africa and practiced in Africa for hundreds of years. So he argues that they've been around long enough to be considered indigenous in their own right, especially in certain parts of the continent where they've been practiced for so long. But moving back to his discussion of medicine men, mediums, and diviners, some African medicine men are taught how to prevent magic, witchcraft, and sorcery, which indicate that there is a presence and belief of magic as both present and as a negative in African societies. But it's more complicated than that, and the magic seems to split both ways. Or maybe some see magic as bad and see good as not explicitly magic, but maybe the divine. Mbiti says nobles are said to patronize medicine men because, quote, their magic is good magic. Some medicine men are mediums or diviners. Mbiti says he's attended some of these ceremonies with these medicine men, and he feels that they are practicing genuine faith and magic. These mediums or diviners strike me as being described very similar to monks or nuns, and that they're given new names and new identities. They live in seclusion and are essentially reborn. And part of what Mbiti talks about in this book is the concept of time. One of the most notable contributions from this work is his discussion of the African concept of time. And he describes this as more of a two-dimensional phenomenon with a long past, a present, and virtually no future. This perspective significantly influences various African rituals and beliefs. Many African cultures perceive time as cyclical rather than linear in fashion. Events and experiences are seen as part of this continuous cycle, including the seasons, agriculture, and rituals. But the emphasis and importance of the present continues in other places in this book. Take a second here to contrast that with Western thought and how we're so invested in a future that may never happen, and that we also see time as linear. And if we're looking at time as this straight line, maybe that's why we're so focused on where the line's going and where we're going to be versus just being here on the line. In many of our worlds, time is our overlord. It controls us in ways that I don't think we really acknowledge or maybe even fully understand. I think part of walking a spiritual path is about releasing our attachment to time. And so maybe there's something deep and meaningful to be learned from these African indigenous teachings on how they conceptualize time. Before we move on, please subscribe by hitting the watermark in the lower right-hand corner and share this with any friends and family who you think might benefit. So now we're going to talk about our connection with land and our home. Mbiti says Africans are particularly tied to the land. And this really struck a chord with me. Ever since I read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, I had this great realization that we aren't in nature, but we are nature. I'll quote Mbiti here on people leaving the land and moving to the city. There's a fundamental severing of ties which cannot be repaired, and one which creates psychological problems with which urban life cannot as yet cope. And I'm not sure this problem of urban life, whether physical, psychological, or spiritual, can ever be completely solved or dealt with. This isn't intended in any way to condemn urban living or people in cities. It's just to point out that we have this base tie back to the land, to Gaia and the earth, to green. And science tends to support this idea as well, that we're tied to nature and green. Part of this seems to be due to the isolation of the person, not just from the green of the world, but also the separation of the individual from the people that they know and their community. And I think this is a beautiful idea that Mbiti is talking about here. Think about being surrounded by the beauty of nature all around you, and combine that with the idea of being surrounded by the warmth of people who love and support you, who are there for you if you need them, when you need them. I have great hope in humankind, and I see the beauty of where we are today in our recent transition to technological existence as something we can look at to understand ourselves better. In the absence of living amongst our tribe and surrounded by the green of Mother Earth, we can still find community and connection if we just slow down and look for it. We have to get back to it. And that's part of what Kishar does, the spiritual community that I work within. If you're looking for a peaceful community where people can share their journeys, be themselves, find that attachment back to each other and the earth, please visit kishar.org. As we consider religion and philosophy in Africa, we have to also look at its history. We couldn't cover this subject without discussing the severe impact of colonialism on Africa. The Berlin Conference took place between November 1884 and February 1885. All the major European powers were there along with the United States, and there were no African representatives present at this conference. The Europeans essentially just sat around in a room and divided up Africa as they saw fit. This period led to extensive exploitation of the African people and their resources. The artificial borders were drawn during the conference, and this interference by European powers has had lasting political and social implications for African countries. And we can't ignore that. We have to acknowledge that it happened and continue to acknowledge that it happened. But in this book, going back to the positive and the beauty of the great thought from Africa, let's look at how community is such a deep and rich part of spirituality in Africa. Mbiti says, traditional religions are not primarily for the individual, but for his community of which he has a part. I love this quote so much. So many times you'll hear me talk about the richness of community, going back to how we can all better connect with each other. That's the journey that we're all on that doesn't have to be a lonely one. Mbiti continues by saying, to be human is to belong to the whole community, and to do so involves participating in the beliefs, ceremonies, rituals, and festivals of that community. A person cannot detach himself from the religion of his group. For to do so is to be severed from his roots, his foundation, his context for security, his kinships, and the entire group of those who make him aware of his own existence. So there's this idea, this spiritual idea in Africa that the community is spirituality. It is our being. It is our existence. And they go into the power of ancestors, and part of this, the deep importance of community is understanding and honoring their ancestors. When someone dies, their family honors them by pouring out libations and offering bits of food. The point is the deceased relatives are remembered, and in doing so, they're memorialized, and that they still exist, even if they passed, that they came before us and are us, a part of where we came from and who we are. In some traditions, a past ancestor becomes the living dead for a time. They retain many of their human qualities that they possessed in life. The living dead are considered to be completely dead once the last living relative that knew them also dies. I think it's a powerful concept about who remembers us and what we are. The respect paid to elders and ancestors really takes me back to when I read the Analects of Confucius, because there's such a powerful message there that is very similar. And in some of these traditions, it isn't about achieving an afterlife as achieving something better. For these ancient practices, the idea is to live here and now. And that is the most important concern. And this takes us back to the ever common theme of valuing the present moment, living for today and deciding to just be. That just being is everything. And this takes us to, you are the universe. And Mbiti says, what people do is motivated by what they believe. and what they believe springs from what they do and experience. So then, belief and action in African traditional society cannot be separated. They belong to a single whole. It's a wholeness, a oneness that we see in a lot of spiritual traditions. My personal take is that we're all part of this universal oneness, deeply connected, but also able to experience this oneness within us in a very personal way. Mbiti beautifully speaks on this as he says, in African traditional religions, there are no creeds to be recited. Instead, the creeds are written in the heart of the individual, and each one is himself a living creed of his own religion. Where the individual is, there is his religion, for he is a religious being. It is this that makes Africa so religious. Religion is in their whole system of being. I'd say that each of you could do the same and consider living the creed of your own religion or your own brand of spirituality. Live what's written on the heart of you as an individual. Be yourself. There's great power there. There's great peace and calm there. What did you think of African Religions and Philosophy? Have you read this book? What stuck with you the most about this book? Do you think time has domain over you or control in your life? Are you aware of this? How do you see your spirituality as connected to your community and back to nature? And like this video if you'd like us to keep making content just like this. And until next time, I wish you peace on your journey.